Across the years he ruled, a man learned to govern Rome by offering, again and again, to lay down his power. He fell sick on his own showcase campaign in Spain, and finished his memoirs on a victory his soldiers won while he lay ill behind the lines. He married Rome to a single household. He lost 3 legions in a German forest, and for once the composure broke in public. When he died, the inscription he had left was raised in bronze at his mausoleum and copied into stone in provincial cities. This is the story of how he made one man's rule look like the Republic restored. In Rome, on the morning of the 13th of January, in what we would later call the year 27 before the Common Era, the Senate House was waiting. Inside, the benches had been arranged, the enlarged post-war Senate crowded the room, and the doors were closed. The man they were waiting for had been consul, alone or with a partner, every year since the 2nd of September 31 before our era, when Agrippa's fleet defeated Antony's at Actium. 700 senators had crossed the sea before Actium, lending the war against Antony the shape of Senate and people. By January 27, that same language returned to Rome, cleaned of salt and blood, and stood inside the Curia as constitutional theatre. He was 35 years old, and the last political victor at the center of 50 years of civil war. When the doors opened, he entered alone, in the plain white toga of a private citizen, with no laurel crown, no purple border, and no military dress. He stood before the Senate, and the senators rose. He thanked them, said he was tired, and declared the Republic restored, res publica restituta. The work of the civil wars, he said, was done. He was returning all his powers to the Senate and people of Rome, and retiring to private life. Our sources cannot tell us how long the silence lasted, only what came next. The senators rose and begged him to reconsider. They pressed on him a package that the surviving modern historians treat as carefully staged. A 10-year proconsular imperium over the army provinces, meaning every region of the Roman world with a legion stationed in it, except the single legion left in senatorial Africa and Egypt held under his own equestrian prefect. The consulship, year by year, as he wished it. The corona civica, the oak wreath for saving citizens, to be carved above the door of his house. The Caepios virtutis, a golden shield of virtue, to be set up in this Senate house, inscribed with the 4 qualities the Senate ascribed to him: virtue, clemency, justice, and piety. The room did not need a throne, it needed a direction of gaze. The facade carried Caesar's name, and inside the Senate would begin its sessions before victory and the shield of virtues, while republican procedure continued under edited architecture. He accepted the formula the Senate had staged. The Roman Republic had not been abolished, it had been declared restored, preserved in its forms, and placed under a single first citizen, a princeps. 3 days later, the Senate convened again. Lucius Marnatius Plancus, a senior consular who had changed sides from Antony to Caesar in the year 32, rose to propose a new cognomen for the man who had handed power back and accepted provincial command in its place. The word he proposed was Augustus. The word came from auger, to consecrate, to increase, to make grow. It belonged to priestly vocabulary, not political command, and it had not been used before as a Roman personal cognomen. The Senate voted, and the performance that had begun on the 13th was sealed on the 16th. Augustus had declared the Republic restored, laid down the imperium he had held since the war with Antony, and returned legions, provinces, and magisterial powers to the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate had refused the return. Senior consulars argued that the state could not be left without the man who had restored it, and Augustus accepted the package of provinces and 10-year command with reluctance, and for the sake of the Republic. The performance was the substance: renunciation, senatorial protest, reluctant acceptance. That grammar would be renewed through his life and transferred at Tiberius's accession. From this point forward in the surviving record, the man's name is Imperator Caesar Augustus, Divi Filius, Imperator Caesar Augustus, son of the deified Julius. In what we will now call the Principate, the modern label for the system the Senate had just assembled across the sessions of the 13th and the 16th of January, The new order had a person at its center before it had a name for itself. The senators called it the Restored Republic, the poets called it the New Golden Age, provincial inscriptions called it Augustan, and legal documents continued to speak of the res publica, as if no change had taken place. The system would keep adding powers in answer to circumstances. Tribunician power in 23, imperium maius proconsular in the same year, the chief priesthood in 12, and father of the country in the year 2 before our era. Ordinary Roman terms could describe magistrates, commands, priesthoods, honors, and provinces. They could not describe a citizen who stood above all of them while claiming to have restored them, so Rome reached for sacred language. By the 16th, this is what had been assigned to the man at the center of the painting: a 10-year proconsular imperium over the army provinces of Spain, Gaul, and Syria. Egypt under an equestrian prefect answering directly to him, 1 legion left in senatorial Africa, the consulship as he wished it, the oak wreath above his door, the golden shield of virtue in the Senate house, and the new name. The army was no longer allowed to float loose among rival commanders. Most of Rome's legions stood in the provinces held under Augustus's 10-year command, while Egypt's forces stood outside senatorial reach altogether. The senatorial provinces, the older Mediterranean territories whose governors continued to be appointed by the Senate, had at most 1 legion between them in Africa. The Senate continued to meet, consuls continued to be elected, tribunes kept their veto, popular assemblies voted, Roman magistrates wore the togas of the early republic, and every republican form remained intact. Above the door of his Palatine house, the civic crown was carved and the laurels stood at the doorposts, salvation and triumph placed where a private citizen lived. The settlement of 27 was constitutional theatre standing on a material base, and the material base was Egypt. The wealth that had flowed back to Rome after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra helped pay the discharge bonuses of the triumviral legions, the settlement of veterans on board Italian land, the rebuilding of the city, the Senate's crowns, and the Apollo Palatine. The provincial command Augustus, accepted with reluctance, included Egypt under his personal control, governed by an equestrian prefect and closed to senators without his permission. Through that province flowed the grain that fed Rome, and the settlement was not free. The public face of the new order was the settlement in the Curia. The private face was a villa on the Esquiline, where Gaius Maecenas, wealthy, Etruscan, equestrian, and without senatorial rank, managed Rome for Augustus when Augustus was away. Maecenas had been trusted with the city while Augustus and Agrippa were at war, and he brought Virgil, Horace, and Propertius into his household. He had no place in the formal constitution, and the system could not have functioned without him. Maecenas is visible because he patronized poets. Livia is harder to see, but nearer to the center. She was the daughter of Marcus Livius Drusus Claudianus, who killed himself after Philippi rather than serve under the triumvirate. She married Augustus in 38 while pregnant by Tiberius Claudius Nero, and the marriage lasted 52 years. The Tacitian tradition, written a century later by a hostile senator, gave Livia a lethal shadow over the succession. The earlier local record does not corroborate it. In inscriptions, dedications, and preserved letters, she appears as patron of cities, correspondent with kings, receiver of delegations, and a public figure whom Roman vocabulary could barely name. The mechanism for Maecenas and Livia was the household. Augustus lived in a modest house on the Palatine, with an atrium, small rooms, a garden, and a library wing connected to Apollo's temple. His freedmen handled correspondence, petitions, accounts, and access. By the end of the reign, these household channels carried business the formal constitution could not comfortably name. The Senate met to debate while the household decided. The legions had been raised piecemeal across the civil wars: Caesar's, Pompey's, Brutus's, Antony's, and Augustus's own. Augustus reorganized them as a permanent standing army, fixed to provinces and chains of command. Each legion's oath, the sacramentum, was sworn to him personally, not to the Senate. Service was fixed at 16 years in the legions and 12 in the praetorians, with discharge bonuses paid from Augustus's own purse. The later 20-year contract and dedicated military treasury would come after Pannonia and Teutoburg revealed the cost of the arrangement. The old citizen soldier had crossed between field and forum. Augustus ended that rhythm: continuous service, fixed pay, discharge terms, and a permanent army with a permanent memory of who paid it. Augustus assigned personal guard cohorts to his protection, the cohorts praetorii, the Praetorian Guard. They were dispersed across the city and nearby Italian towns. The centralized barracks would come under Tiberius and Sejanus. The most ominous armed presence near Rome began as a deliberately scattered one. Before the settlement, the cost of the standing army had been paid in Italian farmland. In the proscriptions of 43 and the years after Philippi, estates were seized for veterans across 18 Italian cities. One family belonged to a small farmer near Mantua named Virgilius. His son Publius, later the poet Virgil, remembered the loss in the eclogues. He is the man Maecenas would bring into the Esquiline circle. 3 decades later, when the standing army ran short of money for retirement bonuses, Augustus founded a new military treasury from his own fortune and deposited 170 million sesterces on the first day. By the surviving records arithmetic, he was the personal paymaster of the Roman army. The golden Caepio virtutes stood in the Curia Julia. A marble copy was sent to the Roman colony at Arelate in southern Gaul, and that copy survives, with its 4 words on the rim: virtus, clementia, iustitia, pietas, virtue, clemency, justice, piety. The first visual program of the new system was in place before the man at its center reached 40. In the year 26 before our era, Augustus left Rome to fight a war. The Cantabrians and Asturians, hill peoples of northern Iberia, had never been fully subdued. He chose their country for his showcase campaign. The victorious commander in the field, hailed imperator by his troops in the period sense, not the later office word. Their country made Roman campaigning slow: mountain settlements, difficult routes, and resistance that refused the clean set-piece battle a Roman commander preferred. Augustus arrived in the spring of 26 with a massive force, including 7 legions. The Roman answer was roads, forts, and the slow conversion of difficult country into administrable country. The most cited tradition is the Mountain of Medullius. In Floris's later version, a surrounded Cantabrian clan burned its settlement, poisoned its wine, and fell on its swords rather than surrender. The story is dramatic and late. Whether it preserves an event or a Roman literary commonplace about barbarian dignity in defeat, the surviving record cannot decide. Roman Spain would become settled and prosperous, while the Cantabrian highlands remained peripheral, lightly garrisoned, and not entirely peaceful. The army was split into columns. Augustus was present, but illness soon carried him back to Tarraco, while his subordinates continued in the mountains. The sieges were slow, the defenders fought from fortified settlements, and stories survived, stylized or real, of warriors killing themselves rather than surrender. By late autumn, Augustus was ill at Tarraco, and his subordinates finished the war. By the spring of 25, he was back in Rome, writing or revising the closing book of his autobiography. The full autobiography has not survived, but the portion known in late antiquity closed on the Cantabrian victory. Later historians can tell us little about which mountain settlement Augustus sat outside and which he did not. The official record speaks confidently of his presence, while the unofficial record shows a sick man at Tarraco finishing a book about a war his army was winning above him. The sources who quote him leave the impression of a careful, restrained, occasionally defensive Roman general explaining what he had done and why. The historians writing 60 years later would not use that voice. In the same year, a new Roman colony was founded in western Iberia, Augusta Emerita, later Merida. It received discharged veterans of the Cantabrian campaign and extended Roman roads, settlement, and urban habits into the western provinces. The colony was the quiet afterimage of the war: discharged soldiers, surveyed land, and a Roman town where the campaign had left men to live. In the summer of 23 before our era, 2 years after the Cantabrian campaign, Augustus fell seriously ill in Rome. Believing he was dying, he gave his signet ring to Marcus Agrippa and the official papers of state to Piso, the senior consul. He made no formal arrangement for a successor because the Roman political system had no inherited office. A Greek freedman physician named Antonius Musa was called. Musa prescribed cold water bathing, a treatment conservative Roman practice forbade for fevers. Within days, Augustus was sitting up. The cure entered the political memory of the reign because it saved the man who had become the Roman state. When he recovered, he stood before the Senate and proposed a new settlement. He resigned the annual consulship he had held since 31 and accepted a different combination of powers. The first was imperium maius, greater imperium, over all the provinces, allowing him to intervene anywhere and override any governor. The second was tribunicia potestas, tribunician power, the power of a tribune of the plebs without election to the office. It gave him sacrosanctity, the right to speak in the people's old protective language, and an annual dating mechanism for the reign. He no longer needed the consulship. In the spring after the second settlement, Lucius Licinius Murena, the brother-in-law of Maecenas, the senator Fannius Caepio, and their associates were accused of conspiring to murder Augustus. Goldsworthy reads the conspiracy as unlikely to have been invented, though its motives remain obscure. Murena's connection to Maecenas brought the scandal into Augustus's inner circle, and the accused men were convicted and executed. The date in the surviving record falls either in 23 or 22 before our era. What matters here is the concurrence. Augustus had just laid down his 11th consulship, accepted a new constitutional architecture, and faced a senatorial assassination plot against the arrangement Rome was still learning to understand. The architecture is worth tracing because it shows how little monarchy needed to call itself monarchy. The tribunicia potestas, the tribunician power, carried the tribune's old language of sacrosanctity, initiative, and veto. Augustus, an adoptive patrician of the Julian line, could not hold the plebeian office, so the Senate gave him the powers without the office. The imperium maius proconsular was the legal architecture of provincial command. An ordinary proconsul's authority stopped at his province. Augustus's greater command exceeded the authority of any governor in any province. By the autumn of 23, after illness, conspiracy, resignation, and grant, the constitutional architecture of the Principate was substantially complete, though the regime would keep adding pieces for the rest of his life. Later in the same year, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, nephew, son-in-law, and designated heir, fell ill and died at 19. Augustus recited his name in the Senate, commissioned the theatre on the Campus Martius to bear it, and lost the succession plan that had begun with Marcellus's marriage to Julia. In a private room on the Palatine, Publius Virgilius Maro read aloud from the Aeneid. The poem traced Rome and the Julian house back to Aeneas of Troy, and its procession of unborn Roman heroes ended with a young man who would die before his time. The name was Marcellus, and Octavia is said to have fainted. Virgil died in 19 before our era with the poem unfinished. His will instructed his literary executors to burn the manuscript, and Augustus ordered it published. The Marcellus passage stayed, and the boy who died at 19, with Augustus's only daughter for a widow, became the figure on whom the Aeneid hangs its family cost. In the year 20 before our era, Augustus traveled to Syria. His stepson Tiberius, the elder son of Livia and now 21, met a Parthian embassy on the Roman side of the Euphrates. Frats IV returned the standards captured at Carrhae and other eastern defeats. It was a treaty, not a battle. Augustan power also traveled through clients who built in its name. Herod sank Roman concrete into the coast and named the harbor city Caesarea, turning loyalty into a breakwater. The same order reached downward to a village that could measure its tax grievance against the price of a red cow named Tharis, and still believed the petition might reach Augustus. The prima porta statue would render the Parthian settlement as victory, Tiberius receiving the standard from a kneeling Parthian noble, diplomacy made to look like command. Parthia continued to exist, and remained the only land power on Rome's eastern frontier that Rome could not subdue. In the year 18 before our era, between the Parthian settlement and the secular games, Augustus introduced new marriage and adultery legislation. The Lex Iulia de Maritandis Ordinibus required senators to marry, pressed senatorial and equestrian couples toward children, and penalized the unmarried and childless. The Lex Iulia de Adulteriis Coercendis made adultery a public prosecution, with exile and partial loss of estate as penalties. The senatorial class objected and formally asked that the laws be reconsidered. Augustus answered by staging the family as evidence that private reproduction had become public policy. The laws were not repealed, and they were widely ignored. In the summer of 17 before our era, the Roman state held the Secular Games, 3 days and 3 nights of ritual for the end of one age and the beginning of another. The Senate commissioned Horace to write the Carmen Seculae, sung by 27 boys and 27 girls of the Roman aristocracy on the Capitoline and Palatine. The hymn named the marriage laws, Roman fertility, and peace. The prayer was old in texture and new in grammar. Augustus asked blessing for the Roman people, for the priestly board, and then for himself, his house, and his household, making the domus part of the public future. Earlier that year, Augustus adopted his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, the sons of Julia and Agrippa. Gaius was 3, Lucius was newborn. They were adopted out of their natural father and made Augustus's sons. Agrippa, who had won the campaigns Augustus celebrated, was bypassed. Julia, the daughter through whom the succession moved, was bypassed more completely. Dynastic succession had a visual program before it had a constitutional name. In the years 16 and 15 before our era, Drusus and Tiberius conducted simultaneous campaigns in the Alps. Drusus marched from northern Italy into the Inn Valley, Tiberius moved from Gaul. The Rhaetians and Vindelici controlled routes Rome needed. The conquest made the passes part of the Rhodan supply system linking Italy, Gaul, Illyricum, and the Rhine. The Alpine War was the conquest of inconvenience, merchants, messengers, supply carts, and armies paying for mountain passage, until Augustus turned embarrassment into a campaign. The political fact was that expansion under Augustus was being carried out by sons and stepsons. The man at the center was civilian, the men extending the frontiers were family. In the year 12 before our era, Marcus Agrippa died at 51. He had been Augustus's general at Norlochus, Actium, and every celebrated campaign since Philippi. He had been Julia's husband, father of Gaius and Lucius, and father of Agrippa Posthumus, born after his death. His body was placed in Augustus's mausoleum on the Campus Martius. The architecture of the settlement was now without its architect. In the same year that Agrippa died, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the last surviving triumvir, died as well. The office of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome, passed to Augustus by election. The state's calendar, priestly colleges, festivals, and public sacrifices were now under his personal control. In the year 7 before our era, Rome was reorganized into 265 new neighborhoods, each with a compitum, a crossroads shrine. Each shrine held 2 Lares, household protective spirits, and a third figure, the Genius Augusti, the spirit of Augustus's own household. The shrines were tended by vicomagistri, often freedmen, who became the lowest visible rung of the Augustan civic order. A freedman could not become a senator, but he could now hold a recognized neighborhood role and offer libation at an altar bearing the gods of Augustus's family. Lugdunum was an altar city and a hinge. Roads met there, supply moved through it, coinage was struck there, and the Rhine frontier could be fed from a network that made Gaul more Roman by making it more useful. In 12 before our era, at the confluence of the Rhone and the Saône, Drusus dedicated an altar to Roma and Augustus jointly. Representatives of the Gallic communities attended, and similar provincial forms carried the Augustan cult beyond the city. In the provinces, where senatorial constitutional theatre did not reach, Augustus received cult with Roma. Whether worshippers understood him as a god in the strict sense need not be asserted. They treated his image and genius in the form reserved for divine recipients. Rome already knew that a fire brigade could become a political machine. In the late 20s, Egnatius Rufus had made himself popular by organizing slaves to fight fires, and the city rewarded him faster than the law allowed. In the year 6 of the Common Era, after another major fire, Augustus created the Vigils, 7 cohorts under the prefect of the Fire Watch. They were divided across the 14 Augustan regions. The point was fire control and political control. Public safety could not remain a private ladder to power. The moral legislation returned to Roman households in legal language. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis made adultery a criminal offense in a state court. The Lex Julia de Maritandes Ordinibus penalized the unmarried and childless and granted privileges to parents. The old senatorial families resisted, and the laws were repeatedly weakened by the Senate and renewed by Augustus. What had been a private senatorial matter was now public criminal law. The surviving record gives few prosecutions and uncertain numbers of bonus marriages, but the reform left a moral vocabulary Roman public life would use for the next century. Across the years 13 to 9 before our era, Drusus, Livia's younger son, conducted 4 campaigns into Germania. He crossed the Rhine, reached the Elbe, and died from injuries after his horse fell on the return march. His body was carried back to Rome, and the funeral made the cost of dynastic command visible. On the 30th of January in the year 9 before our era, the Senate dedicated the Ara Pacis Augusti on the Campus Martius. Voted in 13 on Augustus's return from Spain, the altar's outer walls carried the senatorial procession of dedicators. Augustus stood at the center. His family was ranked around him. The children of the house held the hands of priests. It was an argument for dynastic continuity in marble. In the year 8 of the Common Era, Augustus exiled Publius Ovidius Naso to Tomis, the Roman frontier town on the western Black Sea. Ovid would never return, and writing from exile he named the cause as Carmen et Era, a poem and a mistake. The poem was the Ars Amatoria, the art of love, which had treated the moral legislation as material for parody, and the mistake was never named. Within a year, Pannonia would be crushed, and Varus would lose 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest. The moral regime had caught its most famous poet on the eve of its worst military year. By the second year before the Common Era, this is what stood in Rome. The Forum of Augustus had just been dedicated around the temple of Mars Alta, Mars the Avenger, on a vow made before Philippi to avenge Julius Caesar's murder. Inside the temple stood Mars, Venus, and the deified Julius. Around the court stood the Summi Viri, the great men of the Republic, from Aeneas and Romulus through Camillus, Scipio, and Caesar. The line ended with Augustus's own statue at the center. The new forum was not a marketplace. It was constitutional architecture, the place where the Senate met to declare war, triumphal generals deposited captured standards, military decorations were assigned, and senatorial boys came of age in the toga virilis. It argued in stone that Rome's wars, Rome's old families, and Rome's republican past culminated in the Augustan present. The Prima Porta statue, whether carved before or shortly after his death, stood at Livia's villa north of Rome. It showed Augustus barefoot like a hero addressing troops, with the return of the Parthian standards on his breastplate and Cupid at his calf to mark Venus and the Julian line. The figure made diplomacy look like battlefield command. On the Campus Martius, the mausoleum begun in 28 stood completed. 300 Roman feet in diameter, a colossal bronze statue on top, the civic oak above the entrance, and the place prepared for the bronze tablets of his own account after death. Agrippa's Pantheon, completed in 27, was a rectangular peristyle temple, not Hadrian's later rotunda. It held statues of Mars, Venus, Caesar, and Augustus. Agrippa had wanted a colossal Augustus in the central position. Augustus refused, preferring to be one of the gods of the place rather than its center. On the Palatine, beside his house, Augustus had dedicated Apollo's temple in 28, with public Greek and Latin libraries where scholars and poets worked. Apollo's precinct converted Actium into culture. Victory, poetry, and the Palatine household could be read as one arrangement. The theatre of Marcellus, completed in 13, carried the name of the nephew who had died at 19 and stood at the end of Virgil's procession of unborn heroes. It opened with public games, and half a millennium later the building was still standing. The water of Augustan Rome was Agrippa's. In 19 before our era, he built the Aqua Virgo, named for the girl said to have shown the engineers the springs, and supplied the baths he had built on the Campus Martius. Nearby stood the Egyptian obelisk from Heliopolis, set up as the gnomon of a vast pavement sundial, with a bronze meridian line running across the marble near the Ara Pacis. Modern arguments about the exact birthday alignment remain contested. What is not contested is the composition: Egyptian sun, Roman peace, and the city's calendar arranged together on the Campus Martius. On the coinage, the same program moved through ordinary exchange: divine sonship, civic honors, peace, recovered standards, and the signs by which Augustus wanted his rule to be read. In the year 6 before our era, Tiberius, granted tribunician power for 5 years and second only to Augustus in the constitutional architecture, withdrew from public life and sailed to Rhodes. He would spend 6 years there as a private man, while the succession moved on without him. The official cause was exhaustion, and the unofficial cause in the surviving record was the marriage Augustus had forced on him: divorce from Vipsania, Agrippa's daughter, and marriage to Julia, Augustus's only daughter. The marriage had become a political and domestic disaster. Augustus did not recall him, though Livia remained his mother and advocate. For 6 years, the man who would inherit the Principate lived as a private man on a Mediterranean island. In February of the year 2 before our era, the Senate, the equestrian order, and the people declared Augustus Pater Patri father of the country. In the same year, he discovered that Julia, aged 37, had been conducting affairs. The list named at least 5 senators, among them Aulus Antonius, son of Mark Antony. Julia is the household figure whose story the surviving record cannot agree on. Tacitus and Suetonius made her exile to Pandateria a moral collapse. Macrobius, drawing on lost earlier sources, preserves a witty, educated, politically dangerous Julia who could dress for her father's eyes one day and her husband's the next, and explain her children's resemblance to Agrippa with the deadpan line that she took passengers only when the ship was full. She had been married 3 times to her father's chosen successors, and could be read both as perfect Roman matron and as the impossible satyr of the Lex Iulia. Whether the exile punished the conduct named in the decree or concealed a political conflict the record cannot identify, remains the problem historians inherit. Augustus exiled his only daughter to Pandateria, denied her wine and male company, and applied to his own house the adultery law named for the Julian family. Aulus Antonius killed himself, and the other named men were exiled or stripped of rank. In the year 2 of the Common Era, Lucius, the younger adopted grandson, died at Massilia while traveling west, when Augustus was 65. 2 years later, Gaius died after service in the east. Augustus adopted Tiberius and Agrippa Posthumus together on the condition that Tiberius adopt Germanicus, the son of Drusus. The succession sequence was now visible. In the year 7, Augustus exiled Agrippa Posthumus to Planasia. The official cause was the boy's ferocious nature. The field had narrowed to Tiberius, the man who had spent 6 years on Rhodes refusing to be the heir. In the year 6 of the Common Era, Illyricum revolted. Pannonia on the middle Danube and Dalmatia on the eastern Adriatic rose against Roman control. Velleius Paterculus, serving on the ground with Tiberius, reported between 200,000 and 300,000 fighting men, including 200,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry. Augustus treated it as the greatest danger Rome had faced since Hannibal. The revolt began among the decitiates of the Dalmatian uplands, when their warriors were mobilized as Roman auxiliaries for Tiberius's planned campaign against the Marcomanni. Barto of the decitiates refused, and the Brusei on the middle Sava joined under their own Barto. The revolt spread quickly enough to alarm Italy. The route from the lower Danube to the head of the Adriatic ran through those uplands, and the surviving record says Augustus believed Italy itself could be invaded. He addressed the Senate, called an emergency levy, recruited freedmen into cohorts voluntarii, and prepared to march himself if Tiberius could not contain the revolt. Augustus stayed in Rome at 69, and Tiberius commanded. Tiberius was sent not with a punitive column, but with 15 legions and matching auxiliaries, more than half Rome's combat strength. A permanent army could now be swallowed by one emergency. The war ran for 3 years: sieges, marches, attrition, fortified mountain settlements, and forest country. Velleius, Tiberius's officer and later loyalist witness, praised a victory won by patience, supply, and refusal of theatrical risk. One Barto surrendered before the other. Dalmatian resistance fought on until the year 9. The Roman political class at home found Tiberius's patience harder to admire, and that judgment would follow him as ruler. By autumn of the year 9, the revolt was crushed. Tiberius returned to Rome, and the Senate offered him a triumph. He refused, deferring the celebration until the 12th of October in the year 12, after Teutoburg had taught Rome what its frontier could and could not hold. In the same season, Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania, marched the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions through the Teutoburg forest. Varus was a consular senator who had governed Africa and Syria. In Germania, a developing province in Roman theory, but not yet pacified in Roman practice, he governed in the Syrian style, mobile courts, Roman taxes, and settled province administration. The Germans were not Mediterranean provincials. Among the local nobles serving Rome was Arminius, a Cheruscan prince with Roman training, Roman rank, and standing among the German leaders preparing revolt. By late summer, he had helped organize resistance to receive Varus's column as it moved toward the Rhine winter quarters. Varus did not know what had been prepared. The march began in early September. Varus's column stretched through wet forest with 3 legions, auxiliaries, cavalry, and the baggage train of a settled province tour. German attacks struck the flanks and dissolved into the trees. Rain, mud, and broken ground exhausted the column and broke its order. Pneumonius Vala tried to break out with the cavalry and was killed. Varus fell on his sword. Chionius surrendered the survivors, and Roman officers were executed at German altars. The 3 legions were destroyed, their numerals were never reissued, and their eagles were taken. In Rome, the news broke the public mask. Suetonius preserves the reaction. Augustus tore his clothes, beat his head on the doorframe, and cried, Quinctili Vea, legions red. Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions. He refused to cut his hair or shave for months, wore mourning publicly for the rest of the year, and marked the anniversary of the disaster for the rest of his life. He did not go to the frontier or avenge Varus, and the Rhine became the line Augustus would no longer try to erase. After Teutoburg, Augustus moved between Rome, Campania, and the machinery of succession. He was 73, then 74, then 75. The documents of succession and memory stayed close to the household and the vestals. The practical work passed increasingly to Tiberius. Even at the end, succession had one more shadow. A story circulated that Augustus sailed to the island where Agrippa Posthumus was held and met the grandson he had adopted and cast out. Goldsworthy treats the tale cautiously, but Rome could imagine the old man still measuring the damage his succession design had done. In the late summer of 14, Augustus sailed into the Bay of Naples on a final tour. The crews of Alexandrian grain ships, carrying Egypt's grain under his personal guarantee, lined their railings in white tunics, burned incense, called out blessings, and moved him to tears. Near Puteoli, Roman power answered in miniature: flattery, faith, commerce, and grain supply in one incense-lit sentence. Suetonius preserves the small daily rituals and sayings attached to the last years, including Festina Lent, make haste slowly, a motto Augustus gave to commanders and to himself. He returned to Nola and fell ill. On the evening of the 19th of August, he combed his hair, called for a mirror, and asked the friends at his bedside whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life. When they nodded, he gave them the Greek curtain line an actor spoke at the end of a comedy, asking the audience to dismiss the company with applause if the play had been well played. The Latin tag acta est fabula. Plaudite, the play is over, applaud, is the later popular paraphrase. He died in Livia's arms at 75. Tiberius had been recalled, and the sources differ over whether he reached Augustus before the death. The state was elsewhere: assembly, senate, army, provinces, Rhine, Danube, and city gates. At Nola remained the body, the household, and the Greek tag of an actor leaving the stage. The body of Augustus was carried from Nola to Rome on foot, by night, with local magistrates taking turns along the road. When the Senate convened, Tiberius, Augustus's adopted son and successor by formal vote, delivered the funeral eulogy at the rostra, and Drusus the Younger, Tiberius's son and Augustus's adopted grandson, gave a second eulogy before the temple of Divus Julius. The choreography made the dynasty visible. Senior heir before Senate and people, next generation heir before the deified Caesar, the family line placed inside Roman public ritual. The Res Gestae Divi Augusti was not the document read in the Senate during the accession debate. Tacitus describes a military and financial ledger, the administrative account of a state being handed to another man. The Res Gestae was the first-person monument left for bronze at the mausoleum. The will was read in the Senate 2 days later. Kept in the archive of the Vestals, it named Tiberius as principal heir and Livia as second heir, with bequests to the people and the army. The accompanying political instructions advised the successor to keep Roman power within its present frontiers and avoid further conquest, which Tiberius would mostly observe. On the Campus Martius, the body was placed on a wooden pyre and burned. In the smoke, an eagle was released. A few days later, a former praetor named Numerius Atticus swore that he had seen the form of Augustus ascending through the smoke into the sky. The Senate accepted the testimony and declared him Divus Augustus, joining him to the deified Julius. The bronze tablets of the Res Gestae were raised outside the mausoleum. The same text would be cut into stone in cities across the Roman world, and the surviving copy stands on the wall of a temple in modern Ankara. The Senate continued to meet, consuls continued to be elected, and tribunes continued to hold their veto. In the days after the funeral, the performance of January 27 returned. The magistrate proposed that Tiberius accept the package of powers Augustus had held: tribunician authority, proconsular imperium maius, right of address to the Senate, and supervision of the legions. Tiberius declined, saying the burden was too heavy for one man and asking whether the powers might be divided. The Senate insisted. He declined again. The Senate insisted again. Tacitus, writing a century later as a senator who knew the formal mechanics of the institution, describes the exchange as bitter comedy. The man who already had the powers refusing them, the Senate that had no choice granting them, both sides knowing the fact and neither willing to say it. Tiberius accepted with reluctance and for the sake of the Republic. The formula was Augustus's, and the Principate had transferred according to rules that required the heir to a position no republican constitution recognized to be obliged, by an institution with no real authority over him, to accept a permanence the institution could not name. Tiberius received the imperium maius, the tribunicia potestas, and the legion's oath. The chief priesthood would come later, as it had come to Augustus only after Lepidus died. Later historians would call this office emperor. A Roman alive in the year 14 of the Common Era knew only that the Senate had granted Tiberius what it had once granted Augustus. Within a year, a silver denarius carried the formula, T Caesar Divi Avgf, Tiberius Caesar, son of the deified Augustus. The same formula Augustus had used for himself after his own adoptive father had been declared divine. The system continued under the next man, and the next, long after the word republic had ceased to describe the fact of power. Augustus's most famous public first-person voice survives in one document. He left instructions for the record of his achievements to be set up outside the mausoleum, kept with the other political papers in the care of the Vestal Virgins, inscribed in bronze after his death, and copied into stone in cities across the Roman world. The opening of the text, in his Latin, runs, Annos undiviginti natus exercitum privato concilio et privata impensa comparavi, perquem rem publicam a domination factionis oppressum in libertatem vindicavi. In English, slower than the Latin, at the age of 19, on my own initiative and at my own expense, I raised an army with which I championed the liberty of the Republic when it was oppressed by the tyranny of a faction. He was 19 when he raised that army, 75 when he died at Nola, and for the long middle of that life he held Rome's central power, though no sentence he composed about himself used that verb. Across 35 sections, the document records the offices he was voted, the wars he settled, the buildings he commissioned, the priesthoods he held, and the money he distributed from his own fortune. It does not record the proscriptions of 43 before our era. It does not record the daughter exiled to Pandateria. It does not record the 3 legions in the German forest. The bronze does not survive, and what remains was cut into the stone wall of a temple of Augustus and Roma in Ancyra, now Ankara. The temple is in ruins, but the wall remains and the Latin can still be read. A century after the bronze was set up, Publius Cornelius Tacitus opened his history of the Augustan order with another sentence. He wrote that when all parties had been worn out by civil discord, Augustus took the state into his own hands under the title of first man, cuncta discordiae civilibus fessa nomen principes sub imperium excepit. The bronze and the annals are not the same sentence about the same 40 years. The bronze is Augustus's verdict on his life, set into the wall of a temple of Augustus and Roma. Tacitus gives the senatorial tradition's verdict on what the bronze concealed.